What if the very weapon built to guarantee a nation's survival becomes the instrument of its absolute destruction? Deep beneath the rugged peaks of central Iran, a hidden stockpile of highly enriched uranium sits in the dark. It cannot be moved, it cannot be hidden forever, and the regime cannot afford to lose it. This single volatile asset is now driving one of the most dangerous military standoffs on Earth. It is a silent countdown ticking away beneath layers of solid granite, drawing the world's most advanced intelligence networks and heavy bombers directly toward a single microscopic target. Before we dive into the classified details of this high-stakes standoff, take a moment to subscribe to Weapon Science and turn on notifications. This geopolitical crisis is shifting by the day, and you do not want to find out about these developments 3 days late in the comments. Let's start by dismantling the incomplete picture most people have in their heads. When you scroll through the headlines, it looks like the same endless cycle of Middle Eastern tension. Missiles fired into the desert, tankers harassed, and generals making fierce rehearsed statements on state television. But this time is fundamentally different. The driving force behind this escalation isn't oil, it isn't regional territory, and it isn't even the missiles themselves. It all comes down to one highly volatile, heavily guarded chemical element, uranium. To understand how we reach this critical flashpoint, we have to rewind to the summer of 2025. That was the moment the United States and Israel launched a massive joint air campaign designed to physically erase Iran's nuclear infrastructure, a conflict now known as the 12-Day War. These B-2 bombers flew grueling long-range missions directly from bases in the continental United States into heavily defended Iranian airspace. Their payload consisted of the heaviest, most destructive conventional weapons in the American arsenal, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator. The strikes targeted three primary pillars of Iran's nuclear program: the deeply buried enrichment halls at Fordow, the sprawling industrial complexes of Natanz, and the critical conversion facilities at Isfahan. It was a masterclass in modern, precision-guided aerial warfare. For a brief moment, the international community believed the threat had been neutralized. Satellite imagery showed collapsed centrifuge halls, smoking craters, and completely severed power grids. Analysts openly speculated that Iran's nuclear ambitions had been set back by a decade. But a critical detail was overlooked by the public. In the days leading up to the first bomb falling, satellite intelligence captured unusual, highly coordinated truck activity near the deep tunnel entrances of Isfahan. Vehicles were moving in and out under the cover of night. Independent researchers who spend their lives analyzing satellite telemetry believe Iran's leadership knew the strikes were imminent. They chose to protect their most valuable asset, successfully relocating a massive stockpile of enriched uranium before the first American bomb ever detached from its rack. This wasn't ordinary uranium. We are talking about roughly 400 to nearly 500 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. To put that in perspective, this is not low-enriched fuel meant for a civil power plant. It is a short technical step away from weapons-grade material. So the facilities lay in ruins, but the actual heart of the nuclear program survived intact. Tucked away in an undisclosed, ultra-hardened location, this stockpile remains the ultimate insurance policy for the regime and the ultimate threat to its adversaries. According to intelligence leaks out of Tehran, Iran's supreme leader issued a direct, unyielding command. The 60% enriched material must remain inside the borders of Iran at all costs. No diplomatic pressure, no economic strangulation, and no military threat would change this stance. At the exact same time, American and Israeli officials were aligning on their own absolute position. Any future diplomatic framework or suspension of hostilities would require Iran to ship every single kilogram of that uranium out of the country to a verified, neutral third party. This is a classic irresistible force meeting an immovable object. Two completely opposite, non-negotiable demands, with neither side willing to blink first. This unresolved clash is the silent engine driving every military strike and economic blockade we see today. But by announcing to the world that they are keeping this highly enriched stockpile hidden within their borders, the Iranian regime made a critical strategic error. They turned their most valuable deterrent into a giant permanent target for every Western intelligence agency. So where is this material hidden today? All signs point to a highly secretive facility located deep beneath Pickax Mountain, known locally as Kuh-i-Kolang-Gazla. This geological fortress sits just south of the heavily bombed Natanz enrichment complex. Years ago, Iran officially declared construction at this mountain site to international inspectors. framing it as a simple replacement facility after Natanz suffered a series of devastating sabotage attacks. On paper, it was a routine civilian rebuilding project. But satellite analysts have watched this mountain transform over the years. This is no simple repair job. The sheer volume of excavated rock and the massive reinforced concrete portals indicate an underground complex far larger and more heavily fortified than anything Iran has built before. Independent geological surveys indicate the facility is buried at a staggering depth of nearly 100 meters. Crucially, it is tunneled directly into solid granite. This geological detail is the core of Iran's defense strategy. Granite is vastly different from the softer sedimentary rock layers that surrounded Fordow and Natanz. It is dense, incredibly tough, and specifically chosen to absorb and dissipate the immense kinetic and explosive energy of American bunker-busting bombs. This geology presents an extraordinary headache for American military planners. The GBU, 5.7 massive ordnance penetrator weighing in at 30,000 pounds, was designed specifically to punch through reinforced concrete, but solid granite at this depth pushes the limit of physics. To overcome this granite shield, weapons experts have discussed a highly complex sequential strike strategy. This involves dropping 2 GBU 5.7 bombs back-to-back with microsecond precision. The first bomb cracks open the rock, and the second punches through the newly formed fissure. It is less like a single decisive knockout blow and more like trying to break into a reinforced bank vault with a heavy sledgehammer. You do not expect a single strike to do the job. You systematically soften the structure before delivering the final penetrative blow. President Trump has been remarkably direct about this looming target. In recent press briefings, he stated in plain language that the United States would strike Pickax Mountain, describing the operation as imminent and warning that Iran has no way to stop it. This is not the carefully hedged, ambiguous language of traditional international diplomacy. This is a head of state publicly placing an active digital countdown clock directly over a sovereign nation's most fortified military installation. Iran's response has followed a highly familiar, aggressive script. State-run media outlets broadcasted warnings that any strike on Pickax Mountain would trigger an immediate full-scale regional war, promising a devastating retaliation that would set the entire region ablaze. But we have to look past the theatrical rhetoric and analyze the actual military reality on the ground. For all their promises of devastating retaliation, Iran's actual military responses over the past year have been surprisingly limited and heavily contained. Most of their retaliatory missile salvos have been systematically intercepted by advanced Western air defense networks. Drones are routinely shot down before they reach their targets, and state media claims of glorious victories are rarely verified by independent observers. The word devastating is carrying an incredibly heavy load in these official statements. The physical results on the battlefield simply do not match the volume of the threats, revealing a significant gap between Iran's offensive capabilities and its defensive reality. To understand how we transitioned from a fragile diplomatic truce to the edge of an active conflict, we have to look closely at the chronological sequence of events. The timeline reveals exactly why this uranium question has become so incredibly urgent. Back in mid-2026, there was a brief moment of genuine hope. The United States and Iran signed a formal diplomatic memorandum designed to wind down the conflict. Iran formally reaffirmed in writing that it had no intention of pursuing nuclear weapons. The immediate result was substantial economic relief. Sanctions were temporarily eased, providing Iran's struggling economy with much-needed breathing room. Global oil prices, which had spiked during the heavy fighting, began to stabilize rapidly. Massive oil tankers that had been sitting dark on international tracking systems to avoid sanctions suddenly switched their transponders back on. They reappeared on global marine maps, legally transporting millions of barrels of Iranian crude to international markets. But the peace was short-lived. In early July, a series of coordinated, deniable attacks targeted commercial shipping vessels passing through the narrow Strait of Hormuz. Suspicion immediately fell on Iran and its network of regional proxy forces. The American response was swift and uncompromising. The president declared the diplomatic truce officially dead, and the U.S. military was ordered to launch immediate heavy retaliatory strikes against Iranian military positions along the coastline. Within a week, U.S. Central Command executed a massive, coordinated air campaign, striking over 100 separate military targets across Iran. They hit coastal radar stations, anti-ship missile batteries, drone launch facilities, and naval command centers. Iran retaliated by targeting more commercial vessels using magnetic mines and suicide drones. Tragically, one of these strikes killed a crew member on an international tanker, crossing a clear red line and forcing a drastic escalation from Western allies. In response, U.S. Central Command instituted a total naval blockade on all major Iranian ports. This was the second such blockade in a matter of months, functioning as a vice grip designed to completely cut off the nation's economic oxygen supply. This blockade is incredibly devastating because over 90% of Iran's annual international trade physically depends on the Strait of Hormuz. When this narrow passage is closed, Iran's ability to function as a modern trading state is effectively paralyzed. The strikes kept stacking night after night. The target list expanded far beyond coastal defenses, reaching deep into the interior to hit Revolutionary Guard command bunkers, underground missile silos, and fast attack naval bases. By the third week of continuous bombing, this had stopped looking like temporary tit-for-tat retaliation. It had transformed into a systematic, deliberate campaign designed to permanently strip Iran of its ability to project military power in the Persian Gulf. Yet throughout this devastating campaign, Iranian officials continued to appear on state television, calmly insisting they remained in complete control, capable of shutting down global energy markets at a moment's notice. The Iranian foreign minister publicly described their military doctrine as an eye for an eye. It is a clean, reassuring phrase for domestic television, but it ignores the stark asymmetry of the actual conflict playing out in the skies. The reality is that one side's eye is being systematically poked out, while the other side's pilots operate from 30,000 feet with virtually zero physical exposure to danger. It is not a fair exchange, it is a clinical, high-tech dismantling. The American Secretary of State offered a much sharper, more realistic framing of the conflict, describing the new U.S. doctrine as a head for an eye. This means any Iranian provocation will be met with a disproportionately massive response. This represents a fundamental shift in the logic of the conflict. The U.S. is no longer interested in matching the scale of Iran's attacks. Instead, they are using every incident as a justification to permanently destroy dozens of high-value military targets. If this detailed step-by-step breakdown is helping you make sense of this incredibly complex geopolitical standoff, please share this video with someone who wants to understand the real forces driving the news headlines. Now let's look at the part of this story that doesn't involve a single missile launch, but is doing far more damage to the regime than any airstrike. We are talking about the complete catastrophic collapse of the Iranian economy. Before the hostilities escalated, Iran was exporting roughly 2 million barrels of crude oil every single day. Within a few months of the naval blockade, that number collapsed to essentially zero, starving the regime of its primary source of hard currency. Their net export revenue for a single month came in at under $200 million. Compare that to their pre-war baseline, which was more than 20 times higher. This is a fiscal cliff that no modern nation can survive for long. The national currency, the rial, has lost the overwhelming majority of its purchasing power. Inflation estimates range from 50 to nearly 70%, making basic foodstuffs and medical supplies completely unaffordable for the average citizen. International economic organizations project that Iran's economy will shrink by more than 6% this year alone. Internal reports suggest senior economic advisors have privately warned the leadership that rebuilding will take over a decade, assuming the war stops today. When you squeeze a government's finances this hard, you start to see what actually holds an authoritarian regime together. It is rarely genuine ideological loyalty, it is fear, and more importantly, it is consistent cash flow. Right now, both fear and cash flow are failing simultaneously. We are seeing unprecedented protests across major cities, with healthcare workers striking over unpaid wages and retirees openly chanting against the regime's foreign military adventures. The regime's response has followed its traditional playbook: mass arrests, violent crackdowns, and complete internet blackouts. But these heavy-handed tactics are yielding diminishing returns as the population's economic desperation reaches a boiling point. In a telling moment of panic, state television abruptly cut away from a live parliamentary broadcast mid-sentence. This suggests a lawmaker was openly criticizing the war effort, saying something so volatile that the censors could not allow the public to hear it. The cracks are no longer just between the regime and its people, they are forming deep inside the ruling elite itself. Hardline factions aligned with the Revolutionary Guard have begun accusing the diplomatic wing of outright betrayal for signing the 2026 memorandum. This brings us back to the hidden uranium stockpile, because this is where every single economic, military, and political thread ties together into a perfect strategic trap. Iran's leadership currently faces three distinct yet equally terrible options. Option one is to ship the material out of the country as part of a comprehensive peace deal. But the Supreme Leader has already forbidden this, and doing so would mean publicly admitting they hid the material from inspectors, destroying their remaining credibility. Option two is to leave the uranium buried deep under Pickax Mountain, hoping the granite shield is enough to survive an American strike. This is a massive, high-stakes gamble against the rapid advancement of Western penetrator technology. Option three is to dilute the material themselves, reducing the enrichment level back down to civilian grade. While Iran's diplomats have floated this idea, doing it credibly would require letting international inspectors back in, something the hardliners refuse to permit. None of these paths lead to a favorable outcome for Iran. This is a trap built not by Washington, but by Iran's own decisions. Every choice to hide, deny, and resist has become the exact justification the West uses to keep the pressure mounting. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been remarkably blunt. In their latest official reports, they noted that Iran is the only non-weapon state to have produced and stockpiled uranium enriched to 60%, calling it a matter of grave proliferation concern. When an organization known for its cautious, heavily negotiated diplomatic language uses terms like grave proliferation concern, it is the loudest alarm bell the international community can possibly ring. It signalizes that time has officially run out. Intelligence agencies estimate that Iran's breakout window, the time required to convert their existing 60% stockpile into weapons-grade material for several warheads, is now under 2 weeks. This incredibly tight timeline is why the US cannot wait. As long as the status of this stockpile remains unverified, the worst-case scenario remains actively on the table. You cannot build a stable, lasting peace when one side refuses to let the other verify the existence of its most dangerous asset. Looking at the wider political picture, the appetite in Washington for this conflict remains incredibly high. U.S. lawmakers have quietly authorized tens of billions of dollars in emergency military funding specifically earmarked for operations in the Persian Gulf. While there is some political division at home, with a symbolic resolution to pull back U.S. involvement narrowly failing in Congress, the funding continues to flow unimpeded. The executive branch shows zero inclination to slow down the pressure campaign. Iran's regional allies have tried to open secondary pressure points to relieve the strain. Houthi forces in Yemen have threatened to blockade the critical Bab el-Mandeb Strait, aiming to create a second maritime choke point for global shipping. But the regional response has been swift. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have joined direct strike operations, recognizing that a second blocked waterway would be catastrophic for global trade. The conflict is pulling in more active players than ever before. There are also persistent reports of Russian assistance to Iran, potentially in the form of advanced targeting data. Moscow has every incentive to keep Washington's attention and military assets divided between Eastern Europe and the Persian Gulf. Iran's strategic bet has always been to outlast Western political will, absorbing the strikes until domestic pressure forces a withdrawal. But this time, the strategic clock is working directly against them because of the unresolved uranium issue. Adding to the instability is the quiet question of political succession in Tehran. The Supreme Leader is in his mid-80s, and any transition of power during a massive military and economic crisis could trigger a violent internal struggle for control of the state. So where does this actually go from here? If Pickax Mountain is struck, the real question is whether the uranium is even there when the bombs fall. It may have been moved again, or it may be permanently buried beneath millions of tons of collapsed granite. In a strange, tragic way, the physical destruction of the stockpile might be the only thing that resolves this conflict. Without a physical asset left to fight over, the primary justification for the war disappears, though the environmental cleanup would be immense. Iran's leadership made a defining historical gamble when they decided to keep that uranium instead of trading it for integration into the global economy. They believed it would give them leverage. Instead, it became the very cage that is locking them in. What do you think happens next? Will Pickax Mountain be struck in the coming weeks, or are we looking at a decades-long standoff? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read through them and want to know your perspective on where this is heading. If this video helped you connect the pieces of a story that has dominated the headlines without much clear explanation, please hit that like button, subscribe to Weapon Science, and share this with someone who wants to understand the real forces shaping our world. Thanks for watching.